Good morning. Good to see everyone this morning. I was a little worried the week after Easter I might be by myself today, so I'm glad to see everyone. I know it's spring break and lots of things. I'm excited to see every one of you, and I certainly appreciate you being here, and I feel sure that the Lord has something special for you today. We're in kind of an exciting and special time here at the church, and some of you guys are aware of this and some of you might not be. But what we're in the process of, well, actually, we have just this past Friday seen the culmination of an answer to a prayer that some of us had been praying for over 6 years about an old piece of property the church owned that we used to owe way too much on and couldn't sell it, and the Lord had made it so that we were able to do away with that debt and sell the piece of property, and that took years, and we had signs sitting out there for a couple of years, and the Lord answered it, and literally this past Friday, just 2 days ago, we closed on that piece of property. So this was a great blessing, and many of you guys know about that, and I say that just, well, to inform you, but also to say that I think this is one of those moments. Every so often I believe God tests us, and when I say tests us, there's a principle that Jesus teaches a lot in the New Testament, and that is, if you're faithful in little, I'll make you ruler over much. And I think this is one of those moments that God has given us an answer to a prayer, and now He's looking at us and going, what will you do with it? So you're going to be hearing in the coming weeks, this is kind of a little commercial, but you're going to be hearing in the coming weeks of opportunities to be more involved. We're going to be working on some different committees and some different projects of things that we wanted to do for a while and maybe weren't able to do. And now we have that opportunity. So first of all, I would just say be praying and asking the Lord maybe how you can be more involved. You guys are such a great group of friends to us and family to us, and be asking how you can be more involved and maybe how the Lord would want you to be part of what we're going to do going forward. I believe this is a great step forward. Now, I said all that to kind of set up what I want to talk about today, because I believe on us as individuals, each one of us as individuals, as well as us collectively as a group, God has placed a call or a destiny in your life and in mine, as well as, I think, us as a church and as a group of believers. And history's full of these stories of these people that received great commands or great commissions from the Lord and went out and accomplished. I mean, it's amazing what they accomplished, far beyond what they could have done. The Bible itself is full of stories. You know, we hear about one man that's a shepherd in the desert confronting the greatest king and military power on the earth and saying, let God's people go, and then leading over 1 million people when the only thing he had really ever led before was some smelly sheep. Leading them for 40 years through that same wilderness and to the edge of the promised land. We hear about a teenage boy killing a giant. We hear about a little man with a little army of 300 facing and defeating and ultimately killing every one of an army of 135,000 men. We hear these great stories, and many of them are condensed into just a few chapters or even a few verses. I'll give you an example. In less than one chapter, this giant named Goliath comes out and confronts Israel's army. Israel's army is afraid. In the meantime, this little teenager named David is keeping sheep for his dad, and his dad calls him in, unaware of Goliath, sends David with some food for his brothers who are in the army. David gets there. Goliath comes out and intimidates him. You know the story. David goes to Saul, says, let me go fight him, goes and kills the giant. And all that happens in less than one chapter. It happens in about 40-something verses. So there's this tendency to think that God just drops these great destinies and these great answers to prayers on people just immediately, and they prayed and it happened, or God said go do it and they just went. But I think there's a process, and I think the same process I see throughout the Bible, and I think it's a process that would do us well to look at, because I think for us as individuals, if you feel like maybe God has placed something in your heart, a dream, a vision, and you're going, boy, it just seems too big, it just seems too hard. Or maybe you think, I've just messed up too much, I thought that was it, but it's too late now. Or maybe for us as a group, as we look forward and we look at the things we feel like God has put in our hearts to do for this community as well as for the world. And when we talk about being on your six and being on all 6 continents, training and releasing indigenous pastors, when we talk about being able to reach out to the community and to be multiple campus and all of these things, they all seem huge right now and far away. And yet there's a process that I find over and over in the Bible. And I think it's really captured succinctly in Isaiah 6 in just a few verses. And so if you have your Bible with you, you may even just know this passage. It's a popular, quite famous passage. In fact, there's been a number of songs written out of this passage of Scripture. But in Isaiah chapter 6, while you're finding that, I want to kind of lay this process out to you, because I think there's 3 steps in, not necessarily in finishing the job, but 3 steps in accepting the call of the Lord to do something. And the first one is the sight. And the sight is when the Lord comes and calls you to do something, the Lord appears and He issues a call in a person's life, to Moses from a burning bush, or to Gideon. And then the second one is the fight. Because typically when God shows up to call you to something, He doesn't call you to something that's easy. I have no idea what's going on, but just don't look at that. Look at me. That's one of the projects we're going to undertake, is that computer that Christopher Columbus actually used to sail the whatever, Nina, Pinta, and Santa. No, that wasn't, he sailed the Mayflower? No, he was the Nina, Pinta. Sorry, I hate to show off my history skills. But anyway, that computer was on it, and so we're going to replace it. Our poor guys in the booth just shouted and ran around the booth once. Anyway, the sight is the first step, and that is God shows up and calls you to something or places something in your heart. And then the second thing is the fight, because there's then a fight to accept what not necessarily fighting the enemy, even though that may come later. This is a fight with yourself. This is fighting to accept what God called, to believe. And the third thing is the right. At that point, when we win the fight, God gives us the right to do it. Because if God calls you to something, it's almost always going to be something kind of beyond your ability, kind of out of your reach, which means this fight, this process of accepting that I can't do it and I need you to do it has to happen. And then God says, now you're ready, now go. And in Isaiah 6, I'll show this to you. First of all, the sight, in verse 1, it says, "It was in the year King Uzziah died that I saw the Lord. He was sitting on a lofty throne, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Attending Him were mighty seraphim, each having 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew." Now, mighty seraphim are not like those little baby angels that some of y'all have sitting around your house. They're like 1-year-old angels. Mighty seraphim don't seem like that. The seraphim are actually mightier than the cherubim, and one cherubim had a flaming sword and kept Adam and Eve out of Edom. And one seraphim led 185,000 people in an army on a march. So 6 of those were around God's throne. They were calling out to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of the heavens' army. The whole earth is filled with His glory." Their voices shook the temple to its foundation, and the entire building was filled with smoke. So first of all, Isaiah sees this magnificent image of God. Not little God, not far away God, but God that fills the temple. In fact, just His robe fills this entire temple. And then around Him are these seraphim, and just their voices, not God's voice, just these angels that are declaring Him holy, their voice shakes the whole foundation, causes an earthquake. And then we find Isaiah moves into the fight portion of it, because when he sees this great God, what's inevitable when we see a big, great, holy God is the next thing we see is what we're not, isn't it? We see that Isaiah sees that I'm not great, big, and holy. In fact, what Isaiah sees is, in verse 5, "Then I said, it's all over, I'm doomed, for I'm a sinful man. I have filthy lips, and I live among a people with filthy lips. Yet I've seen the King, the Lord of the heavens' armies." And then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal he'd taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched my lips with it and said, "See, this coal has touched your lips. Now your guilt is removed and your sin is forgiven." So the second thing is Isaiah realizes, I'm not up to the task. And the reason in his case, he says, is because I'm a sinful man. My speech, I have filthy lips, he calls them. Now, I don't know if that means he used bad language or just that he realized he talked about a lot of stuff that didn't matter so much and didn't talk about the things of the Lord enough. But whatever it was, Isaiah is convicted immediately when he sees how great God is. And then comes the fight of, I don't have any right to even be in his presence. And it's then that God gives him the right. Once Isaiah realizes how great God is, how small and insignificant he is, then God deals with Isaiah's issue, and then he gives him the right. The third thing, then I heard the Lord asking, "Whom should I send as a messenger to this people? Who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." And the Lord said, "Yes, go." In other words, you're the guy now. Before the fight, you weren't ready, but now you're the guy. And over this pattern repeats throughout the Bible. Now, I chose Isaiah because it was short and condensed and really clear, the three steps. But you can find this throughout. Centuries earlier, a man named Moses was called to this seemingly impossible task of confronting Pharaoh and delivering God's people, over 1 million of them, out of slavery and leading them through a desert, mind you, where there's not shopping malls, grocery stores, or even water a lot of times. Leading them through a sea, leading them through dry and barren land, leading them through battles with armies who had weapons and had been trained, and these people had been trained to make bricks, but that's kind of a slow process in battle. If you got to build bricks before you throw them, you're not going to win a lot of battles. So we find God calling on Moses to do this unbelievable thing. Gideon is another example, that the Lord appears to Gideon and calls Gideon to, again, it's a few generations later, and now Israel is in slavery again, but they're not in slavery to Egypt. Moses led them out of that. They're in slavery to a nation called the Midianites. And he calls Gideon and he says, "I need you to go confront this army over here of Midianites of 135,000 people." Now, Moses' fight was with insecurity. When God comes to Moses and says, "Go deliver my people," Moses starts up his motorboat. And he starts, first of all, he says, "What if they don't believe me?" His is all about his own insecurity. What if they don't believe me? What if they ask me who sent me? Who would I say? And God's like, "Hello, bush on fire, voice coming out of it, me." And so Moses goes, "Well, what if, okay, so they believe you, but who am I?" is his next question. First he asks, like, "Who should I say sent me?" Then he says, "Well, who am I?" And he goes on to say, "Because I stutter and because they won't accept me. And in fact, God, maybe you forgot this, but last time I was there, I killed somebody and I was a wanted man. I probably still am. That's why I'm living out here. And my own people told me, you don't have any right to lead us, you little murderer," and all this. So Moses' battle was the insecurity. Now, Gideon had a different battle that God different fight he had to bring him through. And that was when Gideon found out what he was called to do, he sent the word out. And 32,000 people came to help him fight. Now, granted they're fighting 135,000. I don't love those odds. But he's probably going, okay, if each of us takes out 4, I think we're in good shape. If there's the handful that are left, they'll run. But God has to bring him to something different, because what Gideon is doing is relying on others as his source. I don't know if you've ever done that, but I certainly have been guilty of that before. And that is knowing there's a problem and thinking, who do I know? I know I'm the only one that's ever done this. Who do I know that could fix this for me? Who do I know that's a banker, a lawyer, a teacher, whatever, a real estate agent, a car salesman, or whatever I need at this moment? Who do I know that's got more of something than I have? And so what Gideon does is he sends the word out, and 32,000 men come. And God says, no. you got a few too many. And God whittles it all the way down to where he just has 300 men. And the reason God does it is, he said, because you'll think you did it in your own strength. Ouch. So where Moses battles with, I'm not good enough, Gideon has to overcome the tendency to look at someone besides God as his source. And I don't know if you've ever done that, but I'll confess that is a battle at times for me. To stop and go, wait a minute, God, you call me to this. What is it you want to do here? Because I'm busy figuring it out on my own. Now there's a third guy that's a little different example. His name's Jacob. In fact, before there was a nation Israel, there was a man named Israel, and that was Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And God, when he comes out of the womb, tells his parents he's going to be a great nation. In fact, he's going to be the favored one over his older brother. And as they're growing up, the older brother is more athletic, more strong, seems to be a lot nicer guy. Let's be honest, there's not much to like about Jacob's personality. But here's what Jacob develops. He develops this self-reliance. He's a schemer. He figures out how to trick his brother out of his birthright and then ultimately out of the blessing so that he is given the things that God already promised, but he doesn't wait on God to produce them. He becomes the self-reliant, I can always find a way out. He always has an escape plan. And so when his older brother's ready to kill him, he escapes to his uncle, a man named Laban's house. He spends 14 years at least there. And then when Laban is frustrated with him, he escapes again with his family. And he's coming back, and finally the fight comes on the shore of a brook. And his brother has come out to meet him, and he's almost out of options. So what Jacob does is he sends all of his servants and even all of his wife and kids. He has 2 wives and about 12 kids at that time. He sends all of them across the brook on the same side where the brother is. And he stays back here thinking, by the time he gets through killing all of them, at least I can get away. And that night, God's had enough and comes down and wrestles with him. Or as we say down here, wrestles with him. And it is not until, now they wrestle all night. Jacob sounds like maybe one of the few people as stubborn as me in the world. They wrestle all night. Can you imagine? First of all, of course, God could afflict him out of the universe. But Jacob doesn't give in all night until finally God touches his hip and dislocates it. And at this point, suddenly Jacob's plan for escape just went out the window because he can't run. And it's then he finally says, okay, Lord, I won't let go until you bless me. In other words, I'm going to depend on you. For the first time in my life, I'm going to rely on you. And so we have Moses who fights the fight with insecurity and I'm not good enough. We've got Gideon who has to fight the fight with, if I get the right people around me, if I build the right core group, I can do this. And then we have Jacob who just always, I'm a smart guy, I can figure this out, I'll figure out a plan. Now I don't know if any of those fit you. Sadly, all of those fit me at times, and I'll bet you've worn at least 1 or 2 of those hats yourself. But here's what I don't want to get caught too much in. I don't want to get caught too much in the fight, because that's what we tend to focus on. We tend to focus on what do we have to do to accomplish what God commissioned us to do. In Isaiah's case, he had to clean up his speech. In Moses' case, he had to overcome his insecurity and etc. And so we look at, okay, God's calling me this great thing. Now, what is the fight? What is the battle? And one thing to notice about those fights, this isn't fighting with the enemy. That probably will come down the road for you and for me if we accept the call of the Lord in our lives. But the first fight's not with anybody else. It's usually with ourselves. And it's a fight to believe. It's a fight to have faith. It's a fight to say, God, if you told me to go deliver 1 million people from the most powerful military power on earth and I'm a shepherd, I'm going to believe I can do that. Now that's a fight. He hasn't ever called me to anything that preposterous that I'm aware of yet. But But for all of us, we can point at some things in our lives and go, when he said that, I thought I was crazy, or he was crazy. One of us was crazy. And so there's something that precedes this, though, and there's something that I want to focus on this morning, and I don't want us to miss, because it's not the fight. The fight's important, and the fight earns you the right. It earns you the right to lead. It earns you the right to be fruitful in God's kingdom. It earns you the right to be trusted with a lot. Jesus says, when you're faithful in little, I'll make you ruler over much. And it is about the fight and the right, but it all starts with the sight. And that, every great journey of faith that we've talked about began with a great vision of God, or maybe I should put it this way, began with a vision of a great God. And it's easy to move right past this one into the call and into the fight and all of that, but this is most important of all. Isaiah saw first, before anything else, saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. In other words, Isaiah saw this magnificent God. And it informed everything else he did for the rest of his life. In fact, in Isaiah 40, I want you to listen. This same guy writing, I don't know how many months later or years later, but I want you to listen to what he says about this God that he saw. Because this is his perspective after seeing a great God. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this chapter. But Isaiah 40, I'll start in verse 12. Who else has held the oceans in his hand? Listen to how huge Isaiah's God is. Who else has held the oceans in his hand? Who has measured off the heavens with his fingers? Who else knows the weight of the earth, or has weighed the mountains and hills on a scale? And who is able to advise the Spirit of the Lord? Who knows enough to give him advice or teach him? Has the Lord ever needed anyone's advice? Does he need instruction about what is good? No, for all the nations of the world are but a drop in the bucket. They are nothing more than dust on the scales. Now, he's seen a big God. I want to read on just because it should fill you with faith. It does me. He picks up the whole earth as though it were a grain of sand. All the wood in Lebanon's forests and all Lebanon's animals would not be enough to make a burnt offering worthy of our God. The nations of the world are worth nothing to him. In his eyes, they count for less than nothing. God sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to him. He spreads out the heavens like a curtain and makes his tent from them. He judges the great people of the world and brings them all to nothing. To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? Asked the Holy One. Look up into the heavens. Who created all the stars? He brings them out like an army, one after another, calling each by his name. Because of his great power and incomparable strength, not a single one is missing. Now listen what he says next. O Jacob, how can you say the Lord does not see your troubles? O Israel, how can you say God ignores your rights? Have you never heard? Have you never? In other words, when things are going bad, how can you doubt this huge God I've seen? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. And he goes on, he gives power to the weak and strength to the powerless. In other words, Isaiah's entire perspective about anything else he faced. Now, let me say, Isaiah does not have, when God comes to him in Isaiah 6, Isaiah doesn't get a cherry of a mission. Isaiah doesn't get to build a big church or have a great ministry. God tells Isaiah to go tell the people of Israel that even though you have eyes, you're not going to see what I'm doing. Even though you have ears, you're going to be deaf to my voice. He goes and issues a curse over their nation that causes them to crucify the Messiah when he sends him, because they can't see, they can't hear, and that most of them still live under today. Isaiah goes and issues a 2,600-year-long curse at this point. So he's not going to win any popularity contests, but he says, here I am, Lord, send me, because I've seen how great God is. And so anything else Isaiah faced is in perspective of how big God is. And here's what I believe. Our vision, collectively and us as individuals, must never be bigger than our God. Do you understand that your God and my God might not be the same size? I mean, literally He is, but I'm talking about your perspective. A few years ago, I heard a story from another pastor here in town that was in, I forget which nation in Africa, but they were going to do an outdoor event. And they were planning, and I mean, they were planning on having a couple of 100,000 at this big event. And this local pastor, and I'm not knocking him because I would ask the same question, asked this African pastor, what's the plan if it rains? Like, what's the contingency plan, right? Like, you know, especially Africa has rainy seasons. I was there actually during the rainy season once, and it's muddy all the time, and it rains about 4 times in the same day. And that pastor looked back at him matter of factly and said, it's not going to rain. I've prayed. Can I tell you, he sees a bigger God than I do. I don't know what your response would be to that, but it's not going to rain. I've prayed, and it didn't. Now, that might just be luck, but I don't think so. I think this was a man who had learned to see through all he'd been through that God was bigger than he could imagine, and that no vision can be bigger than your God. And we as individuals and we as a church have got to see. It begins with seeing a bigger God. There's a book written back in the 1950s, actually, by a man named J.B. Phillips. He was a British pastor as well as a theologian. In fact, he wrote, may have been the first, he wrote New Testament for in modern language. He started writing it for younger people and translated the New Testament into modern language. But he wrote a book called Your God is Too Small. And he literally meant, in your life, for what you're going through, your God is too small. And so I'm coming down here because, quite honestly, I want to be able to look at you a little bit better. So if your problem seems too big, it just might be your God is too small. If the doctor's report was too bad, it might just be that your God is too small. And when I say I'm talking to myself too. Please don't take this to mean I've got this figured out, and I'll let you in on it in a minute. The point is, for so many areas of my life, if my finances are too tight, and I think that's for anything that seems insurmountable, my God is too small. That's why Jesus, who had seen a big God, said, I can look at a mountain and say, be cast into the sea. How you doing on your mountain moving lately? I'm not doing it so well. I wrote a blog a few weeks ago about moving mountains, and I tend to move them shovelful by shovelful. Now, I do believe God has moved mountains in my life, but I can tell you that at times I think part of the problem is I don't see a big enough God. And my God is too small. And everything else about Isaiah's life and everything about Moses' life and Gideon's life and Jacob's life was changed when they truly saw God. And for us, that's why it's so important that we have a perspective of who God really is. Now, there's a scene in, many of you guys are familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia. Particularly, there is the second book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is probably the most famous. But there's a scene in there where, for those of you that aren't aware, there's a lion in Chronicles of Narnia named Aslan. And he is a picture of, he's a symbol of the Lord Jesus Christ. And in the second book, the 4 children who are the main characters have come to Narnia, and Lucy, the youngest one, has met the beavers. It's a couple that are actually beavers that talk. So if you haven't seen this, you're probably thinking, okay, he ate the wrong mushrooms on his pizza. But no, there are talking beavers in the Chronicles of Narnia. And so she's met these beavers, and they're explaining to her who Aslan is. And that he's God, that he created. In fact, Aslan in one of the books explains that he sang creation into being. And so she's kind of taken aback because I don't know about you, but for most 5, 6-year-old kids, a lion is pretty big and imposing. And she said, is he quite safe? Mr. Beaver says, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. We have, I think what we've tried to do, and when I say we, I mean the church believers collectively, what we've tried to do is make God accessible. And this is a good thing. I think there was a time that maybe you felt like if I don't know all the secret handshakes and the songs, and years ago I showed a video here, Mr. Bean Goes to Church. If you've ever seen that movie, he stands up right when everybody else sits down. He sits down right when everybody stands up. He falls asleep and slides out on the floor. He drops something, is trying to get it and making noise, and then he goes out and backs his car into somebody to leave. It's just, that's how, at one time, it's sort of how church was. If you didn't grow up in it, you didn't know the drill, it was really intimidating. And so we've really worked hard to make church accessible, to say to people, it's not about what you wear. It's not about, saying the right things. You don't have to call people you don't know your brother and sister like we did when I was growing up. I had brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so, and I don't think I was kin to any of them. I'm pretty sure they weren't brothers or sisters. But you don't have to do all that. And we've made God accessible, but we've got to be careful. Because the world doesn't need a small God. We don't need a small God. You and I need a big God. Because there are big problems in our lives, and because there's big things we want to accomplish. We need an enormous God. But here's the thing. Somehow, if we're not careful, we can convince ourselves that the world can't deal with a big God. And we need to make him bite-sized for them. But I got to tell you, people want to be part of something great. And if the God that we've seen is ordinary, and his voice doesn't cause the very pillars of the temple to shake, we're short-selling ourselves, but we're also underselling to the world, because the people we pray for, the people you love and you pray for, I wonder if you think for a second, have you presented God as he rolls the heavens out, like Isaiah says, puts the stars out there and leads them out like an army, calls them by name because of his great power? Is that who they think you serve? Is that who I present? I have a tendency to fall over onto this side of I want to make him seem my yoke is easy, my burden's light, and all of that's true, but I only show that side of him. I don't show the grandness, the magnificence. And the problem is, for every one of us, there are going to be things in our life that demand big answers. And if our God is too small, we're not going to have big answers. We're going to have fear. So we need a big God. The people we love, the people that don't know him, they don't want to be part of something that's mediocre. We don't want to invite them into this romance with an okay husband. Hey, you want to be the bride of Christ? He's kind of okay. We want him to be magnificent. There's actually a third person that needs us to have seen a big God, and that is our enemy. See, there's no question in my mind that my enemy knows how big my God is. That's not at stake. When Jesus showed up, demons came and begged, like, please, let us just go in those pigs instead of just throwing us straight, they didn't fight, they didn't argue, they didn't debate. They got down and said, please. So I have no question the enemy knows God is big. What the enemy needs to know in your life and mine is that I've seen a big God. And you've seen a big God. Because after the sight and after the fight, the internal struggle to believe, and when we earn the right, we will face an enemy. It needs to be an enemy that knows it's not going to do any good to rattle his saber. Because I serve a magnificent God. I serve one that the nations are a drop in the bucket, that picks the earth up like a grain of sand. He needs to know that anything he's got is going to look small next to that. And I need to know that. Now, I want to wrap up a little differently this morning because there's actually an old song we're going to do that is taken directly from this text in Isaiah. And I'm going to just ask us to stand together and to do this old song that simply says, I see the Lord exalted high upon the worship of the people of the earth. I see the Lord. My eyes have seen the King, the Lamb upon the words will be up. But I want to do this song because I want to give us a couple of minutes to respond to this, because before everything else you build in your life, everything else we build as individuals as well as a group will be built on how big is our God. And our vision will never, our fruitfulness will never be bigger than the God we've seen. And I wonder this morning, will you take a minute as we sing this last song, and will you ask the Lord to reveal Himself to you? As much of Him as you can process. I know we can never see all of Him, and that's part of knowing how big He is. But God is love. God is also just. God is also omnipotent, which means all-powerful. Omniscient means He knows everything. Omnipresent, which means He's everywhere. He spoke, and worlds came into existence. And sometimes we lose the fact that that's whose place to dream in our heart, and that's whose place to call in our life. And if He said it, we need to be confident He's able to perform it. In fact, the Bible says, I know who I've believed. Notice He doesn't say, I know what I've believed. I know whom I've believed. And I'm persuaded that He's able to keep that which I've committed to Him. In other words, we need to know who we've believed. We need to know as much of Him as possible. He needs to be as big as possible, so that whatever you've committed to Him, your family, your future, your destiny, your life, you need to know that He's able to keep it. So let's stand, and as I say, we're going to do this old song. You maybe haven't heard it before. It's very simple, and I'm just saying, let's take a moment. I ended earlier than usual this morning because I want to take a moment. I want to say, Lord, before we go forward, before the next step, before we begin to consider all of the things we want to do next, it needs to start with us seeing a magnificent God whose train fills the temple and the whole earth is full of His glory.